Bonnie Walters sat by the large window of her pristine living room, the soft hum of the city outside muffled by the glass. The house was immaculate, as always, a reflection of the carefully controlled life she led. Yet, amidst the polished floors and curated artwork, there lingered an emptiness she couldn't shake off. Her days flowed with mechanical precision. Charity luncheons, business meetings she attended as Hector's supportive wife, and long, silent dinners. Hector had grown increasingly absent, his eyes always fixed on his phone, his touches fleeting. Bonnie never questioned it aloud, but something deep inside her, a quiet ache, whispered that she was no longer the center of his world. She would often catch herself staring at the empty seat across the dining table, wondering when the distance between them had become so vast. One evening, as she absent-mindedly stirred her tea, her best friend Jean Benet's voice cut through her thoughts over the phone. "Bonnie, when was the last time you smiled, really smiled?" Jean asked gently, her concern unmistakable. Bonnie forced a laugh, but it faltered halfway. "I'm fine, Jean. Everything's fine," she replied, though the words felt hollow. After hanging up, she walked through the grand, quiet halls of her home, her heels clicking softly against the marble. The loneliness felt heavier than usual, pressing against her chest. Her reflection caught in a mirror, composed, beautiful, poised, but her eyes told another story. The woman who once felt cherished now felt like a ghost within her own life. Yet she buried the ache, unwilling to face it. She couldn't quite name it, but a storm was brewing, and she sensed it in the stillness of her quiet world. Hector Walters adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, glancing once at his reflection before stepping out of his sleek black car. His face, sharp and unreadable, betrayed none of the duplicity that had crept into his life. The man who had once returned home promptly each evening now found himself entangled in a web of distractions. His days were spent at board meetings, sealing multi-million-dollar deals. But his nights unfolded differently, wrapped around the slender fingers of Teresa Moore. She was everything Bonnie wasn't: lively, daring, reckless. There was an intoxicating thrill in being with someone who demanded nothing beyond the moment. Hector had convinced himself that it was harmless, that he was simply reclaiming some part of his youth lost in responsibility. "You spoil me too much," Teresa teased one evening as he handed her the keys to a brand-new luxury apartment. He smiled faintly, knowing he enjoyed her adoration far more than he cared to admit. Back at home, however, Hector moved like a shadow. The house, once warm, now felt like an obligation. Bonnie's quiet grace seemed like a stark contrast to Teresa's vibrant energy. At dinner, Bonnie would ask softly about his day, and he'd give clipped answers, always glancing at his phone. "You're always so busy these days," she murmured once, her voice light but tinged with sadness. "The company needs my attention," he'd replied without meeting her gaze. But it wasn't the company demanding his nights, it was Teresa with her laughter and bold demands. Each time he left Bonnie's side for Teresa's arms, a small knot of guilt twisted in his stomach, but he pushed it aside. He was too caught up in the illusion, too enamored by the idea of having both worlds at his feet, never realizing how fragile it all truly was. Teresa Moore lounged on the velvet chaise of her new penthouse apartment, her manicured fingers trailing over the screen of her phone as she scrolled through social media, admiring the admiration and envy she effortlessly stirred. Every post, every tagged location, and every glittering accessory was a declaration of her rise, a life she had carefully crafted alongside Hector. She believed she had outshone all others, especially the mysterious, aloof wife she'd heard whispers of, but never met. Why would he stay with her when he could have me? Teresa would joke to her friends, flipping her cascading hair over her shoulder, as though the answer was self-evident. The expensive gifts, luxury vacations, and Hector's constant attention made her feel invincible, as though she had won a game only she knew how to play. She relished the power that came with being desired, convinced her beauty and allure had secured her place. One afternoon, as she sat sipping champagne at a high-end cafe, she spotted a familiar face, Hector's business partner, Todd Donovan, walking past. He greeted her politely, but there was something guarded in his eyes that unsettled her for a brief second. Shrugging it off, Teresa refocused on her reflection in the window, studying her flawless appearance. In her mind, Bonnie was nothing more than a distant figure, irrelevant, a woman too proper, too plain to compete. She's not like me, Teresa would remind herself when doubt crept in, tightening her grip on the diamond bracelet Hector had gifted her. Yet beneath the shimmer of her carefully curated life, there lingered an unacknowledged fear. What if everything she'd built was resting on foundations she didn't fully understand? But Teresa dismissed the thought, convinced that beauty and charm were enough to hold Hector's attention forever. Jean Bonnet watched Bonnie stir her tea absent-mindedly, the cafe's background chatter fading as she studied her friend's distant expression. It wasn't like Bonnie to be this withdrawn, and Jean's instincts told her something deeper was festering beneath her calm exterior. "Bonnie," Jean finally spoke, leaning forward, her voice soft but firm. "You haven't laughed properly in months. Don't tell me everything's fine." Bonnie offered a small, rehearsed smile, but her eyes betrayed the heaviness she carried. "It's just the usual," she replied quietly. "Hector's busy, the business is demanding." Jean frowned, unconvinced. She knew Bonnie well enough to sense when words were masking deeper wounds. "Busy is one thing, Bonnie, but you seem lonely, and you never used to be." There was a silence between them, heavy and fragile, as if Bonnie were tiptoeing around a truth too painful to admit. Bonnie sighed, her fingers tightening around the porcelain cup. "Maybe I've been imagining things," she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I just miss the way things used to be." Jean reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You don't have to pretend with me. Something's shifted, and you deserve better than sitting quietly, wondering where you stand." For a moment, Bonnie's composure cracked, but she quickly smoothed it over with a practiced elegance. "I'll be fine," she repeated, but Jean wasn't convinced. As they stood to leave, Jean glanced at Bonnie and made a silent vow she wouldn't let her friend fade into the background of her own life. Something was wrong, and if Bonnie wouldn't confront it herself, Jean intended to do everything she could to help her see the truth. Bonnie stood by the hallway table, her fingers grazing over the thick ivory envelope that bore the logo of one of the city's most prestigious event organizers. The handwriting was elegant, formal, almost cold. It was an invitation to the upcoming Walters and Donovan annual gala, a night known for its opulence and elite guest list. She read the contents twice, her heart sinking with each word. Hector's name was boldly printed as the guest of honor, yet no mention of her, no personal note from him. She felt like an afterthought, a name only included out of obligation. Setting the invitation down, she walked to the living room where Hector's briefcase lay abandoned. "Hector!" she called softly when he walked in, loosening his tie. "I received the invitation to the gala. Were you going to tell me about it?" His eyes flickered briefly, his smile mechanical. "I assumed it was standard. You don't usually care for those events." Her lips curved into a polite smile, masking the sting of his indifference. "I might attend this time," she said evenly, studying his reaction. Hector merely nodded, already distracted by his buzzing phone. As he disappeared upstairs, Bonnie sank into the couch, the weight of unspoken words pressing on her chest. The house felt too large, too quiet, and somewhere beneath her calm exterior, something simmered. She glanced at the invitation once more, her fingers tracing the embossed gold lettering. For years, she had blended into Hector's world without complaint, the supportive wife, the gracious hostess. But something within her was shifting. She didn't know why, but this time she felt the need to show up, not as Hector's accessory, but as herself. Quietly, she folded the invitation and tucked it into her bag, already imagining how she wanted to feel that night, seen. Teresa stood before her floor-to-ceiling mirror, draping dress after dress across her toned frame, each more extravagant than the last. The gala was just days away, and she intended to be the center of every camera flash. "Which one screams queen more?" she quipped to her friend, holding up a crimson gown before switching to a sleek, silver one. Her friend laughed, assuring her, "Honey, you could wear a trash bag and still steal the show. Hector's got you glowing." Teresa's lips curved smugly. She relished the status the gala would give her, a knight parading beside Hector, publicly flaunting what she believed was hers. Though Hector had yet to confirm how she would be introduced, Teresa convinced herself it was a mere formality. After all, hadn't he showered her with gifts, whispered promises late at night, and set her up in this lavish apartment? That evening, Hector arrived at her penthouse, weary yet obliging as she wrapped herself around him. "You're still coming with me, aren't you?" Teresa asked, her voice sweet but firm, her manicured nails grazing his jaw. Hector hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Of course, you'll turn every head." That was all the affirmation she needed. Teresa grinned, already picturing herself waltzing into the grand ballroom, cameras flashing, the wives and girlfriends of the elite casting envious glances her way. She never once paused to question how precarious her position might truly be. Never wondered if Hector's approval came with conditions. For Teresa, the gala was her stage, and she had no doubt she would own it. Bonnie sat at her vanity, absent-mindedly combing through her long dark hair, her eyes fixed on her reflection, but seeing something far beyond it. The memory of Hector's distant nod echoed in her mind, gnawing at the fragile threads of her composure. Attending the gala had seemed like an easy decision earlier, but now, as the days drew nearer, a quiet dread settled over her. She wondered if she was walking into a room filled with strangers who wore familiar faces, if she'd simply stand at Hector's side like a forgotten fixture. "You don't have to go," she whispered to herself, the silence of the house swallowing her words. Yet a different voice whispered louder, the part of her tired of fading into the background, tired of pretending nothing hurt. Later, as she folded away laundry in their bedroom, Hector appeared briefly at the doorway, distracted. "About the gala," Bonnie began, forcing her voice steady. "Would you mind if I arrived separately?" Hector glanced at her, surprised. "Separately? Why?" She shrugged, offering a faint smile. "I have a few errands earlier that day. It's simpler." He didn't question her further, and that, more than anything, solidified her decision. That night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she resolved that she wouldn't herself to fit neatly into the space Hector had left for her. If she was going to walk into that ballroom, she would do it on her own terms. She had no idea yet how powerful her quiet decision would become, but for now it felt like a first step, an act of reclaiming herself. John arrived at Bonnie's home unannounced, her sharp eyes immediately taking in the faint shadows beneath Bonnie's usually calm gaze. Setting her handbag down, she crossed her arms and gave Bonnie a look that brooked no evasion. "You're going to that gala, aren't you?" Jean asked, her voice casual, but her eyes probing. Bonnie hesitated, folding her arms tightly across her chest as if holding herself together. "I've decided to," she admitted softly. Jean's gaze softened, but there was steel beneath it. "Good. But you're not going just to stand at Hector's side like a trophy, are you?" Bonnie swallowed, unsure how to answer. Jean moved closer, her voice low but fierce. "Bonnie, don't blend in. Let them remember exactly who you are." They sat together by the window, afternoon light casting long shadows on the polished floor. John reached over, clasping Bonnie's hand. "Let's be honest. You've spent years playing by the rules. And where has it left you?" she murmured. Bonnie's eyes shimmered, but she said nothing. Jean continued, "It's time you remind everyone, especially Hector, that you're not invisible." There was something grounding in Jean's bluntness, a lifeline in the quiet storm Bonnie had kept bottled inside. "You know," Jean added, a wry smile playing at her lips, "there's nothing wrong with making them stare." For the first time in weeks, Bonnie let out a soft laugh, faint but genuine. That laugh stayed with her long after Jean left, whispering to her like a seed of resolve waiting to bloom. The boutique was tucked away in an upscale part of town, known only to those who valued discretion over popularity. Bonnie stepped inside, the scent of fresh fabric mingling with soft piano music. As the attendant greeted her politely, Bonnie's eyes scanned the elegant rows of evening gowns. She had no particular design in mind, but something inside her felt restless, searching. Her gaze halted when she spotted a gown hanging alone, champagne gold, shimmering subtly under the soft lights. It wasn't loud or garish, but commanding in its quiet brilliance. "May I see that one?" she asked, her voice calm but purposeful. The attendant brought it to her, and as Bonnie ran her fingers over the delicate material, something in her chest tightened. Inside the fitting room, she stood before the mirror, the gown hugging her figure gracefully, its color catching the light in just the right way. She hardly recognized herself. The poised woman staring back carried a glimmer of something fierce, something alive. The attendant peeked in, her eyes widening. "You look stunning, ma'am. That gown was made for you." Bonnie didn't respond immediately, her fingers lightly grazing the fabric. She thought about the whispers, the polite smiles, the years of measured silence. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine not just being present at the gala, but owning the room. "I'll take it," she said quietly, but with a conviction that left no room for doubt. As she stepped back onto the street, the sun glinting against her skin, Bonnie felt something she hadn't felt in a long while: power. The evening before the gala arrived, heavy with a silence that seemed almost anticipatory. Teresa, in her penthouse, had her dress laid out, an eye-catching red piece designed to demand attention. She sprawled across her couch, confident, sipping wine, her phone buzzing intermittently with messages from friends eager to see her grand appearance. "Tomorrow, they'll know who owns the spotlight," she murmured to herself, admiring her reflection as she rehearsed the smile she'd wear when she entered beside Hector. There was no doubt in her mind. Bonnie was irrelevant, a footnote she wouldn't spare a thought for. Teresa's world was carefully curated, and she was sure it was only a matter of time before it became permanent. Across town, Bonnie's home felt serene, almost unnervingly so. She sat by her dressing table, gently polishing the pair of earrings she'd chosen, simple, elegant, the perfect match for the champagne gold gown hanging ready in her closet. Jean had called earlier to check in, her voice filled with excitement. "Tomorrow's your night, Bonnie. Walk in like you own it." Bonnie had merely smiled, tucking the phone away after their chat. But now, as night deepened and the city lights twinkled outside her window, a quiet resolve settled over her. She wasn't thinking about who might be watching, or who might whisper. She was no longer focused on Hector's indifference or Teresa's existence. For the first time in a long while, Bonnie was doing something entirely for herself. And in that stillness, beneath the surface, something within her felt ready to bloom. Teresa descended the grand staircase of the ballroom like a woman stepping onto a personal stage. The gleaming chandeliers above cast a golden hue over her crimson gown, each delicate sequin shimmering as she moved. Her arm confidently looped through Hector's, her smile poised yet sharp, daring anyone to question her presence. Flashes from cameras flickered like stars as photographers took notice, and she relished the attention, heads turning, murmurs trailing after her. "You're the center of every eye tonight," Hector muttered near her ear, attempting to sound light, though there was an edge in his voice. Teresa leaned closer, whispering, "They should know who holds your gaze, Hector." Inside, she felt untouchable, imagining Bonnie as some distant shadow who couldn't possibly command this kind of scene. The city's elite mingled around them, but Teresa walked with the air of someone convinced the night belonged solely to her. Yet, as she made her way through the glittering crowd, subtly glancing over at Hector's taut expression, a flicker of doubt threatened to surface. Every step she took was rehearsed, measured, crafted to solidify her place beside him. Business partners smiled politely. Women offered tight-lipped compliments, but beneath their gazes, she sensed something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Todd Donovan approached with his usual charisma, exchanging pleasantries with Hector before turning to Teresa. "You look irradiant, Teresa," Todd said, though there was a glint in his eye that felt more observant than admiring. She gave a practiced smile, brushing it off, convinced no one could pierce the perfect image she presented. Tonight, she thought, is proof that I've won. But far across the ballroom, the night was quietly preparing to rewrite itself. The ballroom doors opened with barely a sound, yet somehow everything seemed to pause when Bonnie stepped inside. She wasn't rushed, nor did she seek attention, but attention found her anyway. The champagne gold gown clung to her figure in all the right ways, its subtle shimmer catching the light each time she moved. Her hair, swept into a sleek updo, exposed the elegant curve of her neck, and her face was calm, composed, yet entirely magnetic. Conversations faltered, glasses hovered midair, and a ripple of whispers broke out like a soft tide. Bonnie walked in alone, no escort on her arm, yet there was an undeniable gravity to her presence, as if the entire evening had been waiting for her to arrive. She met no one's gaze immediately, her eyes surveying the room as though weighing every soul present before deciding whether they were worth her attention. Hector's breath caught involuntarily the moment his eyes fell on her. Teresa, sensing the sudden tension in his body, turned her head just in time to catch sight of Bonnie gliding past the entrance. Her own smile faltered as she took in the radiant elegance of the woman she had imagined as dowdy and invisible. Bonnie's gaze eventually found Hector's across the expanse of the room, calm, unreadable, but sharp enough to slice through whatever facade he'd wrapped himself in. She nodded politely before continuing on, offering the same composed acknowledgement to Todd and other familiar faces. The sea of people instinctively parted around her, as though recognizing she was not just another attendee, but the quiet center of gravity they hadn't known they'd been orbiting. Every step she took whispered a truth that unsettled even the most self-assured in the room. Bonnie had entered not to blend in, but to command. Teresa's fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne flute, her carefully painted smile beginning to strain at the edges. All night she had prepared for flashes, glances, whispers, but she hadn't anticipated being eclipsed. Across the room, Bonnie moved effortlessly, every nod, every soft smile pulling eyes away from Teresa's carefully orchestrated display. "Who is she?" someone murmured nearby, the question not directed at her, but it sliced through Teresa all the same. She leaned into Hector, voice low but sharp. "Your wife seems to have made quite the entrance tonight," she remarked, the sweetness in her tone brittle. Hector offered no immediate response, his gaze lingering on Bonnie as if trying to decipher something unspoken. Teresa's chest tightened, an unfamiliar sensation creeping in. Was this admiration she was witnessing, or regret? The whispers grew louder, subtle but unavoidable, as Bonnie's calm poise contrasted starkly with Teresa's more flamboyant presence. Todd, ever observant, made his way toward Teresa during a brief moment when Hector excused himself. "You all right?" he asked, voice neutral but eyes knowing. Teresa forced a light laugh, brushing her hair over her shoulder. "Of course, it's just unexpected how much attention she's getting," she replied coolly. But Todd's gaze didn't waver. "Bonnie's always been full of surprises," he said simply, then walked away, leaving Teresa alone with her thoughts. She sipped her champagne too quickly, the bubbling liquid catching in her throat. Across the room, Bonnie didn't seem to notice Teresa at all, and somehow that absence of acknowledgement burned deeper than any confrontation. For the first time that evening, Teresa felt her footing slip. Hector stood near the polished bar, his fingers tapping restlessly against his glass, watching the scene unfold with increasing unease. He had not anticipated the ripple effect Bonnie's entrance would cause. Every calculated step he had taken to keep his double life compartmentalized now felt fragile, unraveling before his eyes. Todd approached, giving him a sidelong glance. "Didn't expect her to steal the room, did you?" Todd murmured, his voice carrying an edge of amusement mixed with something more pointed. Hector forced a dry chuckle, though his jaw tightened. "Bonnie's always had a way of surprising people," he said shortly, eyes fixed on her figure as she moved effortlessly through the crowd. It wasn't just her beauty that unnerved him, it was the distance in her gaze, the way she seemed entirely untethered from him, as though he were nothing more than a guest at her event. As Teresa drifted back to his side, she leaned in, her tone low but clipped. "You've barely looked at me tonight." Hector gave her a tight smile, trying to recover ground. "You're imagining things," he replied smoothly, but the words felt hollow even to his own ears. The weight of the room pressed down on him, the polite greetings, the knowing glances, the whispers that felt louder with every minute. Every move Bonnie made seemed deliberate, calm, while Hector found himself shifting uncomfortably beneath the gaze of people he once navigated effortlessly. He drained the contents of his glass, longing for the night to end, though part of him knew it wouldn't. There were cracks forming beneath the surface, ones he couldn't patch over with charm or empty promises. And standing beside him, Teresa's fingers grazing his arm, he couldn't ignore the gnawing awareness that the facade he'd built was slipping fast. Bonnie felt every glance directed her way, though she moved through the ballroom as if untouched by the swirl of attention. Her posture remained poised, her expression serene, but beneath her exterior, her senses were sharp. She caught the quick, tense glances exchanged between Hector and Teresa, the way Teresa clung a little too tightly to Hector's arm, her smile brittle around the edges. Bonnie greeted familiar faces with graceful nods, her voice measured and polite, but she felt the undercurrent shifting. Several business associates complimented her appearance with slightly startled admiration, clearly unused to seeing her step so fully into the spotlight. She accepted each compliment coolly, unaffected, though inwardly she recognized something vital, that tonight she wasn't here as anyone's accessory. At one point, she crossed paths with Todd, who offered her a glass of wine and a knowing smile. "Quite the entrance, Bonnie," he murmured, his voice low. She met his eyes, her own steady. "I figured it was time I stopped standing in the background," she replied simply, her lips curling faintly. Todd nodded, understanding more than she voiced. From across the room, she felt Hector's gaze on her again, hesitant, almost searching, but she didn't return it. Instead, she focused her attention elsewhere, her presence unwavering. The more she refused to engage in the game, the more it seemed to unravel. And Teresa, standing rigid by Hector's side, felt every ounce of Bonnie's quiet power without a single word spoken. It wasn't about confrontation, it was about control, and Bonnie held it effortlessly in her silence. Jean had watched the entire night unfold from the periphery, her eyes trained keenly on every subtle exchange. She'd seen the way the room shifted when Bonnie walked in, how the balance tilted so sharply it left even seasoned socialites scrambling to adjust. But what troubled her wasn't the attention Bonnie was receiving. It was Hector's barely concealed discomfort and Teresa's growing agitation. Slipping away from the crowd, Jean found Hector alone near the terrace, the cool night air offering him a brief reprieve. She approached quietly, her tone calm but laced with steel. "Funny thing, Hector," she began, her gaze unwavering. "You used to be the one who lit up a room. Tonight, you look like you're hiding from it." Hector turned, masking his surprise poorly. "Jean, I didn't expect." She cut him off with a slight tilt of her head. "Spare me. I've watched Bonnie fade into your shadow long enough. Tonight, she's not in anyone's shadow, and it's rattling you." He swallowed, searching for the right words, but Jean pressed on. "Don't underestimate her. You spent years assuming she'd stay quiet, stay small. But women like Bonnie don't stay overlooked forever." There was no malice in her voice, only a brutal honesty Hector found impossible to refute. Before he could respond, she added one last pointed remark. "You might want to decide quickly if you're ready to face the consequences of that." Then she left him standing there, alone with his thoughts swirling heavier than the night air and far more suffocating. Todd Donovan found himself cornered by a group of younger executives, eager to exchange pleasantries, but his eyes kept flickering toward the tense triangle forming across the ballroom: Hector, Teresa, and Bonnie. He had always known more than he let on, quietly observing how Hector's marriage and business moves intertwined. As the night wore on, he excused himself from the crowd and made his way toward a circle of investors chatting by the balcony. "Interesting turnout tonight," one remarked, sipping from his glass. "Never thought we'd see Bonnie Walters commanding the room like that." Todd smiled faintly and nodded. "She's not just the silent partner anymore," he said casually. The conversation shifted, and before long, the topic of Walters Enterprises' financial backbone came up. One investor leaned in, lowering his voice. "Is it true that Bonnie holds majority shares now?" Todd's smile remained unreadable as he confirmed. "She's the one who's kept this company stable for years." Standing a few feet away, Teresa had paused mid-step, her attention caught unintentionally by their conversation. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but Todd's mention of Bonnie's involvement drew her in. Her eyes narrowed as she listened, pretending to be fixated on the view beyond the terrace, while her ears absorbed every word. Another man chuckled, adding, "Most people assume Hector's the face, but Bonnie's been the one steering things quietly." Teresa's grip on her clutch tightened, her pulse racing. She forced herself to walk away before anyone noticed how visibly the words had shaken her. Back at her table, she sat down slowly, her thoughts spiraling. All this time, she had believed she understood where the power lay. But now, a sliver of doubt crept in. Was the life she had so confidently built actually resting on foundations she didn't control? Later that evening, Teresa found herself wandering near the lounge area, seeking a moment of solitude amidst the noise buzzing in her ears. Hector had stepped away again, distracted, leaving her to fend off polite small talk she no longer had the energy to entertain. She drifted toward the hallway leading to the VIP section, only to pause as she heard familiar voices nearby. Todd and another senior executive were deep in conversation, their words low but clear enough in the quiet corridor. Bonnie's influence stretches further than most know, the executive remarked, his tone light but respectful. Todd agreed. It's not public knowledge, but her investments have kept the company's expansion afloat. Hector may handle the surface, but Bonnie's the one holding the reins behind closed doors. The words hit Teresa like a slap, making her stomach twist. She had always assumed her connection to Hector guaranteed her position, that his power trickled down to her. But here, in a candid conversation not meant for her ears, she realized her entire understanding had been incomplete. Teresa stepped back, her heels clicking faintly against the marble as she retreated, suddenly unsteady. In the glittering world she'd fought to conquer, she was now faced with a disturbing truth. Everything she'd taken for granted might have been handed to her not by Hector, but by the woman she had silently mocked. Returning to her seat, she swallowed hard, her gaze darting across the room until it landed on Bonnie, serene and untouchable. For the first time that night, Teresa couldn't summon a smile. The ride back to her apartment that night felt endless for Teresa. The city lights blurred past the window, but her mind was elsewhere, spiraling through fragments of overheard conversations and moments she had dismissed before. Alone in her living room, she poured herself a glass of wine with trembling hands, replaying details she had once overlooked. The luxurious apartment Hector set her up in, the steady flow of gifts, the consistent financial support. Could all of it have come not from Hector's generosity, but from Bonnie's silent control? Her heartbeat quickened as she remembered how Hector had often been vague about certain transactions, brushing off her questions with charm but little detail. The image she had built of herself as irreplaceable now felt shaky, built on assumptions rather than truths. Unable to sit still, Teresa moved to her desk and pulled up records she'd once paid little attention to, company newsletters, press releases, financial reports she never cared to read. The more she pieced together, the more glaring the pattern became. Bonnie's name appeared subtly but consistently, her influence woven through each corner of the business empire Teresa had thought Hector commanded alone. Leaning back in her chair, Teresa felt a hollow pit in her stomach. She had looked down on Bonnie all this time, convinced she was the prettier, more powerful woman. But now she couldn't ignore the realization that her entire lifestyle, her apartment, the glamorous perks, had likely been funded by the very woman she had dismissed. And suddenly, everything Teresa thought she controlled felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Teresa couldn't sleep. The whispers she'd overheard and the documents she'd skimmed through looped endlessly in her mind. By morning, she found herself dialing a contact she hadn't called in months, a former Walters Enterprises employee she used to occasionally charm for inside information. "David, it's Teresa," she spoke smoothly, masking the gnawing unease in her chest. "Quick question. Who exactly handles the company's major shares? Hector never really talks about it." David laughed lightly, unaware of the depth behind her casual tone. "Oh, everyone knows Mrs. Walters is the backbone," he replied offhandedly. "Hector's the face, but Bonnie's the one with the final say, always has been. She's just quiet about it." Teresa barely managed a polite response before ending the call, her fingers trembling as the phone slipped from her hand. She sat there, stunned, as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. Everything she had clung to, the belief that Hector's wealth and power were what elevated her, crumbled under the weight of truth. The expensive apartment, the endless gifts, the lifestyle she flaunted, it was Bonnie's empire, not Hector's, that propped her up. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away furiously. All this time, she had believed herself superior, believing she had won some unspoken contest. And yet, every indulgence she had accepted came from the very woman she had belittled without ever meeting. The humiliation burned hotter than anger. Alone in her penthouse, surrounded by opulence, she now viewed differently. Teresa finally understood just how precarious her throne had been. Teresa paced her living room, her heels clicking loudly against the marble, her movements sharp and frantic. Every corner of the space mocked her, the designer furniture, the overpriced art, the silk curtains, all bought with money tied back to Bonnie. She couldn't breathe past the knot tightening in her throat. Grabbing her phone, she dialed Hector, but it rang endlessly without answer. When he finally picked up, his voice was cool, distracted. "What is it, Teresa?" She swallowed hard, forcing calm into her tone. "Hector, why didn't you tell me Bonnie owns everything?" There was a pause on the other end, too long, too telling. "It's complicated," he muttered. "She's always been involved." Teresa's fingers clenched around the phone. "Involved. She owns it all, Hector. All this was never yours to give." His silence sliced deeper than any admission. She ended the call abruptly, her hands trembling as she collapsed onto the couch, shoulders shaking. For the first time in years, the certainty she had wrapped around herself unraveled completely. The woman she had always imagined as weak, irrelevant, had been the pillar beneath everything she took pride in. The weight of her own arrogance felt crushing. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but there was no one left to blame but herself. That night, alone in the dim apartment, Teresa cried, not for Hector, not for the lavish life, but for the hollow emptiness she finally felt, knowing she had been nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. Hector stared at his office window, the city lights sprawling before him, but offering no comfort. The night after the gala had left him restless, Bonnie's composed presence haunting him more than he cared to admit. His phone vibrated for the third time, Teresa again, but he let it ring. He wasn't ready for her questions, nor the explanations he owed. A soft knock on his door broke the silence, and before he could respond, Bonnie stepped inside. She closed the door gently behind her, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said quietly, but there was something final in her tone. Hector's throat tightened as he gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her gaze steady. "I won't raise my voice," Bonnie began, her voice calm, almost detached, "but I deserve to know. When did you decide I wasn't enough?" Hector opened his mouth, but words failed him. She continued, eyes never wavering. "All these years I stood beside you. I never asked for recognition, but I never imagined you'd choose to humiliate me like this." Her words struck deeper than any accusation. He wanted to reach for her, to explain, but her poise kept him rooted. "I don't need your excuses, Hector," she said softly. "I needed your loyalty, and now I need space." She turned to leave, her footsteps echoing, leaving Hector in the quiet wreckage of his own making, more cornered than he'd ever been in any boardroom. Gian arrived unannounced, carrying a bag of pastries and 2 cups of coffee, knowing exactly what her friend needed without asking. Bonnie greeted her at the door with a faint smile, her eyes weary but guarded. They sat in the sunlit kitchen, the silence stretching comfortably between them until Jean finally spoke. "I heard about the gala," she said gently, stirring her coffee. Bonnie gave a soft, almost bitter laugh. "I suppose everyone did," she murmured, looking down at her untouched cup. Jean reached across the table, resting her hand over Bonnie's. "But no one saw what I saw. You didn't just walk into that room, Bonnie, you owned it." Bonnie swallowed hard, her composure cracking just slightly as she whispered, "It didn't feel like a victory, Jean. Not when I had to face what my marriage really is." Jean tightened her grip, her voice firmer now. "You've carried his world on your shoulders for years. You gave him loyalty, grace, everything. But don't let his betrayal define who you are." Bonnie's eyes shimmered, though she quickly blinked away the emotion. "I don't even know who I am without him," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Jean shook her head. "You're more than Hector Walter's wife, Bonnie. You're the woman who built an empire while everyone else looked the other way. It's time you start seeing yourself the way others saw you that night." Bonnie exhaled shakily, her fingers curling tightly around her cup. The walls she'd carefully built for years were crumbling, but in their place, something else was taking root, something stronger. Jean gave her hand one final squeeze before adding quietly, "You've always been the foundation. Don't forget that." Teresa paced her living room, her nerves frayed, her thoughts looping endlessly. The weight of realization hadn't left her since the night of the gala. If anything, it pressed heavier with every hour. She had rehearsed her words countless times, but none of them felt adequate. Finally, swallowing her pride, she picked up her phone and dialed the number she'd never dared to use before. The call rang twice before it connected, and Bonnie's cool voice greeted her. "Hello." Teresa's breath caught. "Bonnie, it's Teresa. Please don't hang up." There was a pause on the line, tense and heavy. Bonnie's voice remained calm. "What do you want?" Teresa closed her eyes, forcing herself to speak. "I need to see you. I need to explain. To apologize." Her voice wavered, something she hadn't allowed before. Bonnie's response was measured but firm. "I don't think there's anything left for us to discuss, Teresa." The finality in her tone cut deep, but Teresa pressed on. "Please, just give me 5 minutes. That's all I ask." Another silence followed before Bonnie finally replied, "Not now." And with that, the call ended. Teresa sank onto her couch, her chest hollow, the rejection stinging more than she'd anticipated. She had spent so long believing she stood above Bonnie, only to realize she'd been the one clinging to borrowed power. Now, facing the wreckage of her illusions, she felt smaller than ever. Alone in her opulent apartment, the loneliness pressed in, suffocating in its sharpness. And for the first time, she wondered if some mistakes could never be undone, no matter how desperately she wanted to take them back. Hector sat in his study long after the city had quieted, the soft hum of traffic below fading into the distance. He stared at the decanter of whiskey untouched on his desk, his mind replaying every moment of the gala, every word Bonnie had spoken in her poised yet distant tone. The memory gnawed at him, how effortlessly she had pulled herself away, leaving him standing in the middle of the room like an outsider. He had spent years believing he had control, that Bonnie would always be there, quietly supporting him. But now, faced with the crumbling illusion of stability, he felt the weight of his choices settle heavily on his shoulders. His phone vibrated beside him, Teresa's name flashing across the screen, but he let it go unanswered. He wasn't ready to face her, not when he couldn't even face himself. The following morning, Todd stopped by, unannounced, his expression unreadable as he entered Hector's office. "You look like hell," Todd remarked bluntly, sitting without invitation. Hector didn't bother denying it. Instead, he ran a hand down his face, exhaling deeply. "I've made a mess of everything," Hector admitted, his voice low. Todd studied him for a moment before replying. "You've spent so long thinking you could have it all, Bonnie, the company, Teresa. But now you're standing in the ruins, realizing what mattered most slipped through your fingers." Hector's throat tightened, but he said nothing. Todd leaned forward, his voice steady. "You can't fix this by pretending nothing's changed. Bonnie's not waiting for you anymore." The words hit hard, and for once Hector had no defense. Alone after Todd left, he finally let himself feel the weight of regret, not just for losing Bonnie, but for how blindly he'd taken her for granted all these years. Bonnie stood at the edge of the ocean, her bare feet sinking into the cool, damp sand, the salty breeze tugging gently at her hair. The sky above stretched wide and endless, a canvas of soft blues and golds. For the first time in years, she wasn't tethered to anyone's schedule, anyone's expectations. She had left the city behind for a quiet retreat along the coast, a place she'd visited once long ago, back when dreams and love had seemed simple. Now those dreams were fractured but not lost. She walked slowly along the shoreline, each step steady, each breath a reminder that she was alive, whole, even if healing felt distant. In the solitude of this place, Bonnie began to listen to the quiet voice inside her, the one she'd silenced for too long. There was no Hector here, no cameras, no responsibilities, just her, rediscovering herself piece by piece. In the evenings, Bonnie would sit on the porch of the cottage she rented, a warm shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Jean called often, her voice a lifeline from the city, but never pressing, always understanding. "Take your time, Bon," Jean had said in one of their calls. Don't rush back to the world you left. Build a new one if you have to. Bonnie had smiled, eyes misty but grateful. During her time away, she read books she'd long forgotten, took long walks with no destination, and allowed herself to feel, truly feel, the grief, the betrayal, and the release. It wasn't about running away. It was about reclaiming space, about breathing without feeling like she was drowning in someone else's choices. And slowly, the pain began to dull, replaced by a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. Teresa stood in the center of her penthouse, surrounded by silence. The once gleaming walls, the designer furniture, and the art that had once seemed symbols of success now felt cold, meaningless. Boxes lay scattered around the room, half-packed as she prepared to leave the space she had once called her triumph. She had made the decision after days of agonizing reflection, unable to ignore the truth anymore. Every luxury she'd enjoyed had been tainted, not because it was gifted, but because it was never truly hers. She needed to start over, not as Hector's mistress, not as someone living in the shadows of another woman's accomplishments, but as Teresa Moore, for once honest with herself. The apartment that had once been her kingdom now felt like a cage, and leaving it was the first step towards something real. Later, as the movers hauled away the final pieces, Teresa stood by the large window, looking out at the cityscape she had once believed she'd conquered. Her phone buzzed with calls she ignored, acquaintances who had been quick to disappear once her shine faded. In the silence, she faced herself, stripped of illusions. That evening, she visited a modest studio apartment on the quieter side of town, small, clean, unassuming. It wasn't the life she had known, but it was hers, truly hers. The landlord handed her the keys, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her own decisions, not borrowed, not imposed. As she locked the door behind her, she leaned against it and exhaled, not in defeat, but in acceptance. Teresa wasn't sure what came next, but she knew she had to find her own path, away from the shadows she'd once chased. Hector stood outside the cafe where Bonnie had agreed to meet him, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. He had rehearsed his words endlessly, but now that the moment was near, every sentence felt inadequate. When she arrived, dressed simply in a flowing blue dress, her presence nearly undid him. She greeted him with a polite nod, her eyes calm, giving nothing away. They sat across from each other, a table of silence and unsaid things between them. He reached for his cup, needing something to ground him. "Bonnie," he began, voice thick, "I don't deserve your time, but I need to say this." She remained quiet, allowing him to speak. "I failed you, not just as a husband, but as a man. I was blind, selfish, and I didn't see. Didn't appreciate everything you are." Bonnie listened, her expression unchanged, but her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Hector continued, his voice raw. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. But if there's any part of you that still believes in us, I'm asking for a chance to make it right. Slowly, however long it takes." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. Bonnie exhaled, the weight of his words settling. "I'm not the same woman I was, Hector. I'm still healing, still figuring out who I am without you." She paused, her voice steady. "But I won't rush back into something broken. If there's a future for us, it has to be built differently." He nodded, relief flickering in his eyes, tempered by understanding. They sat in silence, not as a couple, not yet, but as two people trying to find their way back to something fragile, hope. The quiet lounge in the upscale restaurant was nearly empty when Bonnie arrived, her posture calm but resolute. She had agreed to meet both Hector and Teresa at Todd's gentle suggestion, not because she needed closure, but because she was ready to face everything without the weight it once carried. Hector stood when she approached, his eyes soft, cautious, while Teresa remained seated, visibly uneasy, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. For a moment, none of them spoke. The air felt thick with everything left unsaid. Finally, Bonnie broke the silence, her voice steady. "You both asked to meet, so I'm here. Say what you need to say." Teresa swallowed hard, looking up at her, her confidence stripped bare. "Bonnie, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you face to face, I'm sorry. For everything. I didn't know the damage I was causing, and I've paid for it." Bonnie regarded her, her expression unreadable but not cold. "You hurt me." But you also hurt yourself, she replied quietly. I hope you find whatever peace you're searching for, Teresa. But I've let go of any hold you had over me. Teresa nodded, emotion shimmering in her eyes, then quietly excused herself, knowing there was nothing left to salvage but her own dignity. Left alone with Hector, Bonnie met his gaze squarely. You know it'll take more than an apology, she said softly. Hector nodded, his voice low. I know. I'm not asking you to fix this overnight. I just want the chance to be the man you deserve, whether that takes months or years. Bonnie inhaled deeply, feeling the ache within her shift, less sharp than before. We both need time, Hector. Let's not force what's fragile. But maybe, when the dust settles, we'll see what's left. He nodded once more, grateful not for a second chance, but for the possibility of one. Bonnie stood by the large window of her apartment, watching the soft glow of the city lights flickering in the distance. Life felt different now, not perfect, not entirely healed, but hers. The space around her was quieter, filled only with things she loved, no longer heavy with expectation or pretense. John had visited earlier, smiling knowingly as she noticed the calm in Bonnie's demeanor. You've come a long way, Bon, she'd said, squeezing her hand before leaving. Now, Bonnie sipped her tea, thinking back to the conversation with Hector days ago. There was no grand reconciliation, no declarations of love. Just understanding, a mutual acknowledgement that they both needed to grow separately before they could even think of what came next. Her phone buzzed softly, a message from Hector. Hope your day was kind to you. No pressure, just checking in. Bonnie smiled faintly, appreciating the simplicity of it. She typed back, it was peaceful. Hope yours was too. Setting the phone down, she returned to the window, breathing deeply. There was no rush, no demand to force pieces back together. The path ahead wasn't clear, but it was hers to walk, free from shadows. Somewhere down the road, perhaps their paths would align again. But for now, Bonnie was content to stand alone, strong in her solitude, the weight of past betrayals no longer chaining her. And beneath it all, there flickered something soft, something steady, a quiet hope, waiting patiently. Here's the Bible verse for the story. Proverbs 31, verse 25. Strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. Explanation. This verse beautifully captures Bonnie's journey, her quiet strength, grace under pressure, and the dignity with which she carries herself, even amidst betrayal. Despite being overlooked and undervalued, she never loses her inner worth, and in time she rises, reclaiming her place without bitterness. It reflects how true strength lies not in outward appearances, but in inner resilience and integrity. Moral of the story. True strength lies in knowing your worth, even when others fail to recognize it. The story teaches us that power and beauty are not defined by validation from others, but by the quiet confidence and grace we carry within ourselves. Betrayal, manipulation, and appearances may seem to hold sway temporarily, but in the end, integrity, self-respect, and patience triumph. Healing and growth come not from revenge, but from stepping back, reclaiming control over your life, and allowing yourself space to heal on your terms. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.